How do you do? Mr. Joe Drilling feels it would be a little unkind to present the following picture without just a word of friendly warning. We're about to unfold the story of Resident Evil, a game of scientists who sought to create weapons in their own image, without reckoning upon God. It is one of the strangest stories ever told, one that deals with the two great mysteries of creation, life and death. I think it'll thrill you. It might shock you. It might even horrify you. So if you feel that you do not care to subject your nerves to such a strain, now is your chance to, well, we've warned you.
Good evening, folks. I'm Joe. This is Same Name, Different Game, and it is once again that time of year. It is the Halloween season, and if you've been paying attention to all my little self-indulgences so far this year, you will no doubt have noticed that this is the 10th anniversary of my very first Halloween episode. And when I did that one, I didn't really have access to a couple of the ports. Some of the things I'll be talking about this time were not even out or available yet, so yeah, that's a big part of what we're doing here. But also I did a really silly voice for much of that video, and I won't be replicating that here. But let's not dawdle, let's get right to it. A little history about one of my favorite series. The first installment in that series, a game I still have a great deal of love for. It's
Resident Evil.
As I mentioned in my Resident Evil 2 episode a couple of years ago, I wasn't doing little histories when I first talked about Resident Evil. While I did cover a lot of basics in that episode, let's go a little deeper. I've said before that while Shinji Mikami gets a lot of deserved credit for directing Resident Evil, it was then president of Capcom's home games division, Tokuro Fujiwara, who was really the driving force behind the game. Fujiwara had previously been the producer and director on Capcom's Sweet Home, a horror RPG for the Famicom, the Japanese NES. It was based on, or perhaps developed in concert with, a Japanese horror movie of the same name, and released on the same day. The old dark house setting in horror is about as old as horror itself, or at least as old as houses. And Fujiwara combined that with, well, basically Dragon Quest, to make waves on the Famicom. But for him, that wasn't enough. Sweet Home may have been tense and interesting, a novel concept on the Famicom, but it wasn't truly scary. Fujiwara would think about that for the next several years, to the point that it became an obsession to make a true horror video game experience. And with the advent of Sony's PlayStation, he felt he finally had that chance. tapping Mikami as director. With a small team, they collaborated on another old dark house game, a home full of monsters and zombies, inspired in part, according to Mikami, by George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. And I find that interesting because it's the first of Romero's Dead films, Night of the Living Dead, that is mostly confined to a house, not Dawn, which takes place in a mall. That would of course be the much more obvious inspiration for a later Capcom game featuring zombies. At any rate, production went through a lot of different ideas. Initially there was talk of a first-person version, completely made from polygons, not the pre-rendered background seen in the final game. Ghosts were pitched as the main antagonists in the very early goings. But ultimately, zombies as a result of science gone awry and a third-person view on static backgrounds was the direction they went. And it looked a lot like a more modern version of Infogrames' 1992 Lovecraftian horror game, Alone in the Dark. Mikami has admitted now in interviews that he saw Alone in the Dark, and it became the solution to their problem. Resident Evil was Capcom's first 3D game, and as such, they did not have the experience to make a first-person 3D game. But if the backgrounds were static images, like Alone in the Dark, well, then you have something. Alone in the Dark is honestly not a good game in my view. I first saw it and played it on the 3DO, and while it looked good by the standards of the day, the gameplay did not match the quality of the visuals. Still, its influence here is important. Without it, RE may have been cancelled, and it came closer than some know. According to Alex and Neil's excellent book on the first 10 years of Resident Evil games, Itchy Tasty, Capcom was in dire financial straits after Street Fighter II's star began to fade a little, and an American consulting firm recommended canceling what was then in development as Biohazard. Fujiwara, so close to achieving his dream of a true horror video game, fought for the project, acting as a buffer between management and the team. Mikami has said that he had no idea at the time how close it came to being cancelled, but that the team wasn't sure the game would be a hit. But it was a hit. A massive hit. It was the fastest PlayStation game to sell 1 million copies at the time, and it was the best-selling PlayStation game full stop until the juggernaut that was Final Fantasy VII hit later in the year. So let's not beat around the bush anymore, let's talk about the game proper, released in March of 1996 in Japan and North America, and in PAL territories the following summer. It's the first PlayStation game I ever owned, Resident Evil.
What is this?
Known in Japan as Biohazard, the game was renamed in the US for copyright and trademark reasons. It was an internal contest at Capcom's American office that resulted in the name, and honestly, while it seems silly now since so few of the games take place in residences, I think it's a better name for at least the first game. It's been 25 years, so I don't suppose I need to spend too much time going over the story here, but in case you're totally unawares, a police unit called STARS, or Special Tactics and Rescue Service, is called upon to investigate a series of cannibalistic murders northwest of the fictional Midwestern U.S. metropolis, Raccoon City. The Bravo team is sent initially, and when they don't return, the Alpha team is sent in, made up of player characters Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, alongside weapons specialist Barry Burton, helicopter pilot Brad Vickers, Captain Albert Wesker, and zombie dog treat Joseph Frost, who is immediately killed. They are abandoned by Brad when the dogs attack, and seek refuge, where else? In an old, dark house, which it turns out houses a research facility owned by massive pharmaceutical corporation Umbrella. The mansion itself is, in fact, one of the homes of Umbrella founder and eugenics enthusiast Oswell E. Spencer, though he's not really discussed in this game, and in fact is barely seen throughout the series. Look, while the original episode from a decade ago is a bit silly in some places, I'm not making this to replace it. It's more of a companion piece, a large addendum, if you will. So I'm not going to get way into detail on the original long box Resident Evil, but I do need to specifically highlight some regional differences I glossed over all those years ago. Well, I'll start with one I did mention, but wasn't clear about being a regional thing. Auto-aim. In Japan, Biohazard sees your character automatically locking onto the nearest target when raising your weapon. This is very close to a must, because given the nature of the cinematic camera angles at work here, you sometimes can't see enemies clearly. But because of that pesky American rental market, just like with games such as Castlevania 3 and Ninja Gaiden 3, they took it out to make the game harder. Additionally, enemies have more health, deal more damage, and ink ribbons only contain 2 uses each instead of 3. There are also some audio-visual changes. Most notably, the opening FMV sequence removes a lot of the violent content. The team intro also removes Chris smoking, as does his worst ending. Chris wouldn't be seen smoking in a North American released Resident Evil game until this year's Resident Evil Village. This intro also uses a different song in Japan, as well as a different ending theme over slightly different clips in the credits. Finally, for some reason, the non-Japanese versions of the first game don't have pictures of what you're reading when you investigate files in the background there, but later games in the series do. While this game is absolutely best known as a PlayStation game, thanks in no small part to the fact that it got 2 re-releases on the same hardware, Sony's biggest disc-based competitor of the era did in fact get a port of Resident Evil. So let's talk Sega Saturn. Well over a year after the initial US release, in July of 1997 in Japan and October of 1997 in the US, Resident Evil hit the Saturn. According to a blurb in the April 1997 issue of the UK official Saturn magazine, it was based on a proposed PlayStation release called Resident Evil Dash, though I suspect this was a misunderstanding by the English press, because what we know now of Dash is that it was an entirely new game. Basically the first stab at Resident Evil 2, but also a different thing from Resident Evil 2 that we now call Resident Evil 1.5. Either way, this whole thing had to sting for Saturn owners, as the director's cut launched on PS1 the same week, and this version isn't nearly as feature-rich as that version. I just did a sizable rundown of Director's Cut for SNDG Gaiden, so I won't get too into it here, but the biggest thing with regard to the Saturn version is that the new campaign, the Advanced Mode, basically the Director's Cut entire raison d'etre, isn't anywhere to be found here, and nothing in the North American Saturn release is restored from the Japanese game. That is to say, the edits to the cutscenes are the same, the auto-aim is still missing, and so on. This version was ported by Sega's second-party developer Nextech, because, again, according to Anil's book, Capcom didn't have the resources to make a 3D game for the Saturn, and while I can't find anything confirming it, my guess would be that they only had access to resources for the original game, not the director's cut version that was simultaneously being developed at Capcom by Hiroyuki Kobayashi's team. Still, they did find time to make some changes. Obviously, the first thing you'll notice is that this game looks different? I'd say it looks worse, but opinions seem pretty divided on this, and it's definitely a matter of taste. The Saturn, running counter to, well, pretty much every other attempt at doing 3D video games, used square polygons instead of triangular ones, which necessarily makes all the characters and enemies look at least a little different. It also doesn't do transparencies very well, which has 2 effects. First, that all the water in the game is dithered rather than actually transparent. And while I recorded this through my RetroTink 5X, I played a lot of it looking at my CRT, and the dithering is noticeable even there. But that's not all. Shadows are actual transparencies, but because of how the Saturn's processors work, they wipe out certain other graphics. You can see it anytime you walk over the blood pooled around a dead zombie. Also, the in-engine cutscenes are often zoomed in more than the original version. When it comes to audio, there's some weird stuff going on. I don't know enough about the Saturn's audio capabilities to explain it, but it feels like some of the sound effects almost cancel others out. Like, you know how the NES could only make so much sound at once, so in some games, certain sound effects will cause parts of the music to drop out. It's most obvious to me here when you pop a zombie's head with a shotgun. Here's the sound on PlayStation, and on Saturn. I don't think either sound, the exploding head or the report of the shotgun, is actually gone in the strictest sense, but they're trying to play at the same time and almost cancel each other out, so the result is it sounds less impactful. Speaking of sound quality, here's a weird one. I only noticed it in this one place, but Barry has a very different line reading when talking to Jill after he saves you from Plant 42. Listen.
Thanks, Barry.
Don't mention it. What a monster. I can't believe... What the hell is this place anyway?
Los, thanks, Barry.
Don't mention it. What a monster. I can't believe... What the hell is this place anyway?
I don't even know if that's the same actor, and I have no idea why it's different. So, the Saturn version is another one of those any port in a storm things for Saturn owners of the time, but fortunately this version does add a couple things to counterbalance some of that other not-so-good stuff. Most notably, the battle mode. This is the great granddaddy of the Mercenaries mode seen in later games, appearing even before the extreme battle mode of the Resident Evil 2 DualShock Edition. It's pretty straightforward. You run through a series of rooms, killing enemies to score points and set a fast time. There's no reward for doing it extra fast or getting a good score, it's just an extra mode with a couple extra enemies. Of course, this was before we knew what happened to Wesker, so here we see a zombie version of him. The end of the mode also sees a confrontation with a gold tyrant who is just a super-powered tyrant with a lot of health. There's also a second tyrant confrontation in Chris's endgame, or I guess a third if you're getting the good ending. Though it does make you wonder, which of those two attacks you on the helipad? The normal game also includes a new hunter variety called a tick, which is, yeah, just a slightly different looking hunter. The problem with the Saturn port, at least if you're a North American in the modern era, is that that version is extremely expensive, Saturn emulation is a bit and there's just not enough extra content there to justify the asking price. Now I will say here that there is also a PC port of that time, but it's a total nightmare to get it running now. So all I'm going to say about it is what I know of it, which is that it has full color intro movies with the completely unedited versions intact, and it has a better resolution than either the PlayStation or Saturn. But we're going to go in the opposite direction and take the resolution down. Way down. That is, after these spooky messages.
日本映画の面白男伊丹十三があのスイートホームのファミコン化に成功したぞ。呪われた屋敷に閉じ込められてしまった5人のテレビ取材班。この5人を操作して1人でも多く脱出させるのが君の使命だ。さあ逃げろ。グズグズしていると屋敷に殺されてしまうぞ。暗闇に気をつけろ。邪悪なクリーチャーが君を待ち受けているぞ。みんなのことなんか知らないもん。僕は一人で逃げるんだもん。なんていうやつは真っ先に殺されてしまう。みんなで知恵を絞り、お互い助け合わねば脱出は不可能なのだ。僕がやられても君は逃げるんだぞ。さあ、呪われた屋敷から君は脱出できるか。脱出した人数によって5つの感動的なエンディングが君を待っている。愛と恐怖の脱出アドベンチャー、スイートホーム・ザ・ファミコン。心の力を私にください。
アメリカ中西部の町ラクーンシティ。作戦行動中の特殊な警察部隊スターズのメンバーはここである奇怪な体験をすることになる。銃弾が効かない獣の群れに襲われ逃げ込んだ巨大な館だが、その館がさらなる恐怖の入り口であることを彼らはまだ知らなかった。2人のキャラクターから主人公を選び、リアルタイムに流れる時間の中、仲間と助け合い、血に飢えた怪物たちが徘徊する館に隠された数々の謎を解いていく。そして脱出経路を見つけ出し生き延びることが目的である。また選んだキャラクターによってストーリーも変化する。限られた武器を手にここから生きて出られるのか。死より恐ろしい現実がここに。プレイステーション用ソフトサバイバルホラーバイオハザード。
Resident Evil, more terrifying than ever, comes to Nintendo GameCube. Spine-chilling action, devastating weapons, unspeakable evil. Live the nightmare. Resident Evil, exclusively from Capcom. Rated M for mature, only on Nintendo GameCube.
The 1998 release of the Game Boy Color and the Proximus release of the first Pokemon game outside of Japan brought Nintendo's handheld juggernaut back to the fore, and Capcom was more than ready to jump on that. I've already spoken at length about how surprisingly good the Street Fighter Alpha port is, and in the manual for that game, as well as the magazines of 1999, a forthcoming GBC port of Resident Evil was promoted. It never materialized. Well, not officially, but the game was the first attempt at a project by British studio HotGen, co-founded by Probe Entertainment's Fergus McGovern. In 2011, a 90% complete build of the game, along with an even earlier prototype, was leaked onto the internet. And full disclosure, I did contribute a couple bucks to the ransom or whatever for this ROM dump back then, so I guess I'm part of the problem or whatever. Anyways, HotGen made an admirable run at this. It's Resident Evil on the Game Boy Color. And it's hard to judge unfinished games, but if this is 90% complete, I'm not sure I see a better version of it at 100%. It's extremely ugly and very sluggish to play, though technologically impressive, and hey, better than the Gamecom port of Resident Evil 2. What I don't see people talk about is the other prototype of a Resident Evil port to Game Boy Color. Apparently, in 2000, Climax Entertainment did what I guess I can only categorize as a proof of concept. This prototype was dumped to the internet in 2018 and has no gameplay, just some assets basically that you can view. From the extremely limited look, it seems like it was planned to be sort of like a belt-scrolling 2D take on RE, or a mix of that and 3D exploration maybe. It's really hard to say because this is all that seems to exist of it. But what if you wanted something with even less? How about 3 seconds of Chris walking in the killer plant room on GBA? A couple years ago, I showed Raylight Studios' RE2 prototype for Game Boy Advance. It seems they made a pitch for RE1 as well, but this one has never leaked, and all that exists is a few screenshots and this 3-second clip on YouTube. Gaze upon it and consider what could have been, I suppose. And that takes us to, well, the remake. Now, I'm not going to bore you by repeating a bunch of stuff I said 10 years ago, because the purpose of that video was mostly to delineate the differences between the GameCube remake, or the Wii port of the GameCube remake, and the PS1 original. But there are still some things that I definitely need to touch on, expound upon, and of course, I want to talk about the HD version, which has been released in the intervening years. Boy, playing the remake upscaled on a modern setup, using my Wii U here, looks really rough. And the Wii port, as I said 10 years ago, is basically identical to the GameCube, just with the option for poorly thought out motion controls for aiming. But let's make it look a little more tolerable by using the 2015 HD version. Yeah, that's better, isn't it? Now, the biggest thing I need to point out here is that I originally said the armaments between the 96 game and the remake are the same. And, well, no, that's not true. I totally forgot, apparently, that Richard's shotgun is available to both Chris and Jill if you save him from Yawn. And for Jill, there's Barry's Magnum, a ridiculously overpowered gun that can one-shot every enemy in the game except Lisa Trevor, who's invincible, and the final rooftop tyrant. It comes with a full cylinder, but uses special 44 Magnum bullets, which are not found in the game anywhere. So once you use them up, you're done. Also, you can't get the best ending and use it because getting it requires Barry's death. There's also the infinite pistol, which isn't in the original game, and that's another item from Barry's arsenal apparently. It's unlocked as a bonus, and easier to get than the infinite rocket launcher. Man, I wish Barry's Magnum was an infinite bonus weapon so bad. When it comes to differences between the original remake and the HD version, well, there isn't a ton, but there are some. Chris and Jill each get new outfits, referencing their updated looks from Resident Evil 5 and beyond, and you can pick them from the very beginning. And the game can now be played in widescreen, though it mostly looks like they just stretched everything. I'm playing it in that way to illustrate the differences, but I generally prefer to just play a 4x3. There is one more big lure for modern players here: the option to turn off tank controls. Now look, I am not a tank controls hater. I honestly find them a great way to deal with the perspective used in classic-style RE games, especially after the quick turn was introduced in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Still, some people really don't like them, and neither the GameCube original nor the Wii port have the option to turn them off. That's really about it, though that really should be enough, honestly. It looks boss on a modern setup, and you don't have to use the old control style. I mean, it's only like $20, and now it's even on the Switch. It's arguably the best of the traditional RE games, though I would say the original 2 is probably slightly above it in my estimation, but it's a fantastic game any way you slice it. And that does it. At least when it comes to these games, simply titled Resident Evil. But as I said, I just did an episode on SNDG Gaiden about the Director's Cut and DS version, so if you're interested in those, check that out. But for now, let's do like we always do and take a look and a listen side by side.
What is this?
Wow, what a mansion!
Captain Wesker, where's Chris?
Stop it! Don't open that door!
But Chris is...
What is it?
Maybe it's Chris. Now, Jill.
I'm going with you. Chris is our old partner, you know.
Okay, let me handle this. Stay alert!
See if you can find any other clues. I'll be examining this. Let's just hope it's not Chris's.
Obviously, the HD version of the remake looks best, but for the hardware they're running on, I'm not sure any of them look bad. I like the original soundtrack the most, but obviously the remake generally hews pretty close to it and is also great. The Saturn's weird audio problems put it at the bottom of that pile, and I also think the Saturn looks worse than the PlayStation version, but that's not necessarily the consensus. Obviously, most people will say the unreleased Game Boy Color game looks and sounds the worst when put against the rest. And that makes it time to give the edge. And I think that the original Resident Evil gets short shrift, and has pretty much since the remake came out in 2002. And don't get me wrong, it absolutely is one of the best video game remakes of all time. But there's still something there in that original game. The problem is, not in any of the versions that I talked about tonight. If you're going to play original flavor Resident Evil, I would actually recommend either the Black Label Director's Cut on PlayStation or the DS port. The ones here, they're too hard. Vanilla Resident Evil, either on PlayStation or Saturn, had the difficulty artificially inflated, and oh boy, especially if you're new to the franchise, it might just alienate you from ever wanting to pick up another one of these, or at least another classic-styled one. So, of the games I talked about tonight, it's HD Remake all the way. It's the most feature-rich, it's the best looking, and it's the most easily available. It's on everything, including the Switch if you want to play on the go. Now that would normally be it, but it is Halloween time, and before I bid you a happy All Hallows Eve, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of Resident Evil writ large and on me personally. While Sweet Home and Alone in the Dark put games on a path to true horror, a game that could actually be scary, unlike something in the vein of Castlevania, it was Resident Evil that truly broke that barrier. I played this game in the dark with a friend when it was new, and believe me when I say I almost jumped out of my skin when the dogs burst into that hallway. But even beyond the jump scares, and in spite of the very silly script, a somewhat intentional choice to allow non-native English speakers in Japan to understand the spoken dialogue better, the original game still manages to do what I've always thought video games are great at: create a world full of atmosphere. The creepy music, the lonely footsteps, the moans of zombies, all tied up with limited resources. Your palms sweat, you're tense, you worry about what's coming around every corner, and it still works, largely. Sure, the series did go a bit action-heavy for a while, but Resident Evil 4, so often blamed for ruining the series, is a fantastic entry with at least a few unsettling moments. And RE5 is a really fun co-op game. But I am ultimately glad the series found its way back to its horror roots with Resident Evil 7 and the remake of RE2, two of my favorite games of the last generation. At this point, it's not a stretch to say that Resident Evil is my favorite series of games. At least, my favorite series that's still active. The first game came out when I was 13 years old, just beginning to not be a big chicken about horror film, moving past things like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark books and Are You Afraid of the Dark on Nickelodeon, and beginning to embrace works by Sam Raimi and John Carpenter. And that's no doubt in part why I'm still a big fan of the original game. I really do believe that just like Bela Lugosi's hypnotic stare still has the power to unnerve audiences in Dracula, Resident Evil, in the right environment, can do that too. So on this Samhain, go ahead and turn the lights out, pick up a controller, and 25 years after players first experienced it, once again enter the world of survival horror. I'll see you next time. Happy Halloween. Hey folks, it's Joe. Thanks so much for watching me dredge Resident Evil up from my past. First, I gotta give a huge shout out to Stika for doing the Edward Sloan Frankenstein introduction for me. There's a link to his channel in the description. Of course, if you're not watching his stuff, do yourself a favor and check him out. If you dug this show, do all the normal stuff. Like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell to find out about new episodes, blah blah blah. If you really liked it, consider supporting on Patreon. For just $1 per video, you can get early access to new videos, an exclusive weekly column from me, your name here with these cool people, and more. There are also affiliate links in the description and show merch, all of which helps keep the show going and stay ad-free. If you want more Resident Evil, on the left is the full Halloween video playlist, which starts with that original RE video from 10 years ago, and on the right is the longest episode of the show on Resident Evil.